Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Robert Enzerink. I'm a senior consultant with the MarkeTech group. Thanks for joining us today. Now, some of our guests have submitted questions to the MarkeTech group prior to today's webinar, and I've tried to incorporate these where possible. Also, we encourage you to text questions into the webinar question box that should be up on your screen, and I'll address as many of them as we can, either during today's discussion or afterwards. If we don't have time, we'll try to send you an email response. We appreciate you joining us, this discussion about how to get the most out of your key opinion leader events. By way of a little bit of background, the MarkeTech group specializes in medical technology, marketing research, and strategy consulting. We provide these webinars to share our experiences that we've learned in the hope that some of the marketing research techniques that we share can be useful for you to improve your business intelligence and decision making. Today, we'll share with you insights and techniques to make the most of your medical technology key opinion leader engagements. Now, with respect for everyone's time, let's get started. A brief overview, we're going to talk about what is our definition of a key opinion leader workshop, and of course there are many. Why a structured workshop rather than just a standard meeting, and how to maximize your KOL workshops. We'll talk about some methodologies and provide some examples. We will not be talking about projective approaches other than just to mention what they are. And then we'll talk about some logistics and requirements as we go through the presentation for a successful workshop. And often these things are critical to making your event flow and making everyone satisfied with the results. So let's start with, what is a KOL workshop? A key opinion leader workshop, of course, is a meeting. It's a meeting with a specific purpose to gather key insights from a group of experts on a particular subject. Now, those experts in the medical industry tend to be physicians or hospital executives. They could also be laboratory personnel, even patients or patient advocacy groups, whoever are the experts that you need answers from about a particular topic. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to maximize the probability for successful business strategy, whether that's product or marketing or messaging or otherwise. And using specific KOL workshop techniques can help you explore and understand and guide go-to-market execution, sales and marketing communication, and new product roadmaps. Now, of course, the question that needs to be answered first is, why use a structured workshop format instead of a standard meeting? A workshop structure is very effective to ensure that you have a successful outcome. Of course, there are your needs, and meeting your needs means catalyzing often creative thinking, both objective and emotional. And remember that purchasing decisions are made on emotions, and in the end, we're trying to get answers to develop a better product or solution that can be sold, that people will want to buy. So getting the emotional response is also very important during these meetings. Now, your needs, number one, you have a limited amount of time with your key opinion leaders, so you need to use your time efficiently. You may need to make sure that in that limited time, you uncover all the potential ideas or potential futures, expected outcomes, or maybe understand what are the more hidden unmet needs or desired outcomes that your customers have. It's important to identify all the important influences or influencers, the stakeholders, decision makers for your product. In order to be successful, you want to make sure that everyone that attends contributes. You're probably paying quite a bit of money to have these people meet with you. You have important information that you need from them, and it's important that even the quiet people in the group who don't naturally speak out have a chance to contribute, because they're also customers of yours and they may represent a particular segment. In order for a successful meeting, you also want some type of action that gets completed during your KOL event or decisions to be made. And then an important part that's critical, although often it's an unspoken objective, is to develop relationships. You want not only to develop relationships with your key opinion leaders in the particular area or technology that you're bringing them in for, but also you want them to be able to develop relationships with one another. It'll make them more satisfied with the meeting, and it will also encourage more frank discussions. An important criteria that you need to consider when you go into these events in terms of setting your objectives and then selecting methodologies and tools that you're going to use is the purpose of your key opinion leader meeting also for sales, or is it not? And that will direct some of the conversation that you want to engage in and the relationship that you have with people in terms of how much you challenge their beliefs or not. Now, in order to be successful, a key opinion leader event, of course, has to also consider your participants' needs. They also want an efficient use of their time. Their opportunity cost of meeting with you for a half hour or an hour or a day or two is very high. So they want their time to be used efficiently. Key opinion leaders are key opinion leaders because they're influential, but also they want to influence the development of helpful solutions. That's why you brought them in. In order for them to be satisfied at the end of your event, they need to feel like they were heard. They need to feel like they learned something from you and from the colleagues that you brought together. They need to be heard. And they too want to develop new relationships with their colleagues and with you. You're perceived as an expert in your field just as they are in theirs. And at the end of the session, in order to be satisfied and feel like it was a worthwhile experience, they need to have a sense of accomplishment. That idea of being able to contribute something, that you actually reached a decision. So many of the objectives are very much in line. Now, another objective that shouldn't be forgotten is you want the participants to have fun. The more fun they have, the more positively disposed they will be towards you and your team and toward one another, and more likely that they'll come back for another key opinion leader event with you. Now, a lot of people think that these types of events tend to result in primarily qualitative findings, and they do provide outstanding qualitative findings in terms of being able to understand and explore, for instance, a clinical pathway, to identify key decision makers, to gather perceptions of messages or taglines, advertising copy, maybe to test the appeal of a concept. But if designed properly and you use a more structured approach, you can also get a significant amount of quantitative findings out of your key opinion leader events when you bring them together. You could not only understand a clinical pathway, but you could quantify pain points along a clinical pathway. You could rank the influence of the various stakeholders. You could measure the relative importance of product features or benefits with the right tools in place. So we're going to give you some guidance on tools. Of course, we can't give you all the details on exactly how to implement these things. That takes practice and training, and would be certainly much more than 45 minutes to an hour. But we'll give you some guidelines and some examples of tools that you could use to get not only qualitative feedback, but also quantitative or semi-quantitative, depending on the number of respondents you have in your events, but quantitative information as well. Now, the methodology to use is going to depend entirely on the objectives that you have. So be very clear on deciding what your objectives are. I've pulled these 5 out. We'll use these as an example. Other objectives could be things like message testing, resource allocation planning for, say, your R&D teams or your sales efforts, customer satisfaction drivers, preferences for developing a research community. But the important point is that it's very critical to decide what your objectives are for your key opinion leader event. It will help ensure that everyone's objectives, their own objectives, are met in terms of what their needs are, but also helps you guide your time to use it more efficiently, helps you develop the appropriate tools, and importantly, select the right methodology for bringing your group together. So for example, if you wanted to identify market opportunities, good methodologies would be a moderated focus group type setting or a facilitated conversation. If you want to prioritize product features, you may want to do a facilitated conversation or mock trials, and we will cover all 3 of these today. Concept testing, you would consider most likely a moderated focus group or a facilitated conversation. Understanding purchase decision drivers, any of these 3 techniques could be selected depending on some of your specific, maybe your central research question or specific objectives within that. Similarly, prioritizing user needs lends itself well to any of these three techniques. And of course, others you're going to pick a technique depending on your specific objective. Now, there are other techniques, as I mentioned earlier, projective approaches that include things like role-playing, associations, a shopping list technique or imaginary doctor, a Godfather approach. But we're going to focus on the three very useful and powerful techniques that lend themselves best to most typical key opinion leader events. So let's start by talking about moderated focus groups and using a focus group technique for your key opinion leader events. I think you all know that in general, focus group brings together typically between 6 to 8 participants in a moderated discussion with someone actually moderating the discussion, but it's not just a discussion. A focus group has a clear objective. You want to provide answers to specific questions, and the role of the moderator is critical to orient the discussion and keep it moving toward your objectives. The value of a focus group is getting consensus feedback from a group and hearing how they get to that consensus. You could find the idea or concept for which the majority of the group will be in agreement, for example. It's also useful for testing concepts and highlighting differences in the group, seeing the group dynamics, who takes what perspective that's contrary to someone else, for example. So identifying important criteria like what are the decision drivers, what are the value propositions or the unmet needs that are brought up during a discussion. Focus groups are very useful for that. Now, group sessions are typically audio-video recorded. The client or your colleagues could be a passive observer, especially if the meeting is set up, as some of you have seen, with a one-way mirrored glass, so people can observe without being obtrusive. The audio-video recording is often very useful to share with colleagues after the event because you can capture the nonverbal cues and some of the subtleties in how people say things that maybe weren't captured in your note-taking. Now, the process for a focus group, again, important to decide what your objectives are because they'll decide how you want to moderate with a moderation guide, a guide that you'll follow, and the tools that you're going to use. You want to recruit the participants who are your key opinion leaders, and you want to recruit them for this particular group using some type of a screener. That screener could be very informal or could be a very formal screener where you actually have people screen in or out based on certain criteria. You may want to ensure that your key opinion leader group has 3 people that represent, say, a neurology perspective and 3 that represent a cardiology perspective. Or you might want to have a blend of people that would represent, for instance, a value analysis committee, so you have both a clinical and business perspective. So ensure that you recruit appropriately to get the right mix of people. Develop a moderation guide to make sure your objectives are met, and so that the moderator, number 1, manages time well, number 2, manages everyone's contributions well, and number 3, gets all the questions asked. Make sure you have materials, tools, and manipulatives together. And then at the end, make sure that you have the opportunity to summarize key points with your group. Now, there are some limitations to focus groups. The cost tends to be high. You'll need to have a room, some type of facility or meeting center. You probably need to pay higher incentives if the key opinion leaders are not already your consultants. Because there's travel time involved, they need to meet together, which also means there's a geographic limitation. If you're meeting in person, face-to-face, people either have to travel or you're limited to certain geography, and we all know that certain geographies have some limitations and restrictions. And then also you're limited, practically speaking, to about 8 people maximum per focus group. Now, focus groups can be conducted face-to-face, but they can also now, with technology, be conducted over the internet. So virtual focus groups are possible that can minimize or avoid that geographic bias, and they can help reduce your costs. You can share images on the screen, and you could even send out samples ahead of time, maybe have them packaged and tell people don't open these until a certain event or certain time during the discussion when you have a great reveal. Now, there's also a consideration for smaller focus groups, what we call mini groups. This can be either a dyad, which is 2 participants and a moderator, or a triad, which is 3 participants and a moderator. And the mini group really magnifies the effect of the interaction, and it perceptibly increases the speaking time of each participant. A mini group is suggested when you have a very complex issue that requires a lot of in-depth discussion, which means a lot of speaking time for each individual. It may involve greater personal reflection. And mini groups like dyads and triads are also very effective for C-level discussions with hospital executives, CEOs, CFOs, CMO, chief nursing officers. The executive level respondents, we find, really appreciate the collegiality and the opportunity to share and contrast ideas together. And it often results in a lot of aha revelations about how decisions are really made in a hospital executive suite. I should also say that a focus group, and this is addressing one of the questions we got ahead of time in terms of shorter events, a focus group can be a very effective means of moderating a short timeline event, like when you bring some of your scientific advisory board members together or consultants to review a prototype and you only have a couple hours, say, or an hour. A focus group is a very effective way of getting this small group on task and keeping them moving. Now, a typical agenda for a focus group would be setting ground rules and making introductions very quickly, reviewing potentially some of the background, more of an exploratory discussion, discussing knowledge, attitudes, and practices, what we call KAPs, having some type of evaluation or why questioning from some of the initial exploratory discussions. You may want to have a rating or scoring or ranking phase during your focus group. And then you'll work towards soliciting consensus or highlighting distinctions, depending on how the conversation goes. Or you may want to describe a creation or a solution if you have more of a creative group, and then summarize and then close, giving opportunity after you summarize to solicit any last-minute ideas. Often people have an idea percolating in the back of their head that they haven't had the opportunity to bring out yet. And you want to make sure you give them the opportunity in the last few minutes of the focus group to bring out those last minute ideas. Often those are also very important potential objections or concerns that people have that you'll need to address. And then of course close, so everyone feels like there's closure and a sense of accomplishment. Now, a skilled moderator's job is to intensify that thought process and really focus it, or to make sure to generate a lot of creativity. And the moderator's involvement in a focus group is stronger than in the other type of key opinion leader groups that you may want to put together. And you'll need to decide the level of control that's most appropriate. If you have a specific objective goal, a high level of control is more appropriate. The objective in that type of session is to focus on a well-defined subject, produce an interaction between several of the interviewees to get convergence or to highlight their differences. And the aim is to ask questions and present particular items that need to be answered or rated or ranked to make the participants answer very specific questions on, for example, their practice. What do they do? To ensure that the discussions either lead to a consensus or do succinctly result in what are the major differences in opinions or perceptions. If you have a more creative purpose for your focus group setting for your key opinion leaders, where you want them to be creative and inventive, the moderator would have a lower level of control. And this variation of a focus group with a lower level of control is most relevant when you need that interaction to be creative. You want the extra interaction between the participants. It also suggests that maybe a reduced number of participants, less than 8, may be wise, or you may want to break them into, say, 2 groups of 4 or 3 and then bring them back together. So working subgroups could be useful for these creative workshops. And the moderator's role in that case is a lower level of control. You want to stimulate exchanges, allow them to share ideas, and to continue to catalyze the conversation to bring out new ideas while channeling the energy to keep them on track so they don't get too far off base. Now, a couple pointers to improve the efficiency of a focus group or a mini focus group. And this is also the case when you have that limited time and you have a group of clinicians that come together, or a scientific advisory board for a very specific purpose. Say at a conference, you only have 1 hour. What things can you do to improve the efficiency of your time? Number one, if there are any type of freedom to operate type documents, whether it's a non-disclosure agreement, any types of waivers, have those done ahead of time so you don't have to take time during the discussion to get things signed. If there's some type of a waiver required by their institution for audio or visual recording, get that done ahead of time. Another opportunity to improve the efficiency is to have some type of a pre-survey that they fill out ahead of time, submit to you prior to the meeting. Something that looks like this. Here's an example where we ask people what type of imaging systems, both by brand and modality, do they have at their location? In what year was their most recent system purchased? So we get a sense for how up to date these respondents are. Other questions could be asked. What type of treatment do you use for this particular indication? What are their preferred types of instrumentation? What's their preferred approach? Why do they use one type of imaging modality for this indication rather than another? If you have all those things ahead of time, you can use the information that you get from this pre-survey to guide your conversation and understand potentially where some of the differences come from. Why are they taking a certain perspective or another? So getting a pre-survey or these types of items taken care of, like documents that need to be signed ahead of time, will save you time and allow you to use that full limited time that you have, whether it's an hour or half a day. Now, what type of results can you get from a focus group? Most people expect results like this: a lot of text, a lot of general comments, sort of a summary to each objective, some key quotes. And those are the standard expectations from a focus group setting that applies to a key opinion leader event. However, as I mentioned early on, with proper planning, focus groups can provide much more. Simply a well-designed score sheet like this can not only provide semi-quantitative results, but it also elicits more thoughtful responses. So this is an example of a score sheet or a feedback form that we use after presenting a concept to a group where we want to solicit their feedback. So we can ask them not only to indicate on this sheet, and this happens to be a hard copy, we hand it out, we make sure everybody has a pen, and we ask them just circle, how appealing was this concept, scale of 1 to 10. Now you're starting to get some quantitative data, and if you do a number of key opinion leader meetings across different countries, for example, across different regions of a country, or with different demographic groups, you start to get quantitative data where you can compare them. Also ask them to write down in pen, what did they like about it? What did they not like about it? What concerns did they have? And even if they don't have the opportunity because of limited time or because they're unwilling or uncomfortable speaking up to answer these questions and provide their dislikes maybe, by writing it down, you can collect these forms afterward and you get additional information. Also, another benefit in terms of time efficiency is that when you hand these out and ask a group of 6 or 8 to write these down and circle their appeal score, they're working in parallel. So this parallel processing by respondents also improves time efficiency. Instead of having them in turn speak, you don't need to get all this information back from them during the conversation. Just ask them to highlight the important points. Another example of an appeal score, you present a few different alternatives, you ask them to score each, and then by simply adding an additional line item, and you prepare this ahead of time by designing your score sheet appropriately, you then ask them, and you could have multiple pages of this, you could have 12 different potential solutions, ask them then to rank order, so that if they find all appealing, you have another way of getting some quantitative information, and then you can ask them who gave this a top 3 ranking. You could also ask them to only select what are their top 3. So another way to get some quantitative data and more thoughtful responses from your participants. Finally, another value for bringing your key opinion leaders together and using a focus group type approach is to understand prior quantitative findings. This is an example of a quantitative finding we had from a survey, and surveys, quantitative tools like that aren't great at answering the hows and whys. And in this case, you can see where the arrow is. that we asked respondents to who did you speak about your diagnosis. And 88% of diagnosed respondents, those who were actually diagnosed with the disease, said they had talked to a healthcare professional. Fine. The question we had was, what about the 12% that are diagnosed but indicate that they never spoke with a healthcare professional? Seemed very strange to us. How do you get diagnosed without speaking to a healthcare professional? And we asked that question of the group, and we got some very interesting answers about how people are self-diagnosing, or they didn't think through this answer. But we got some very interesting answers that we would not have been able to get any other way. So providing explanations for prior quantitative findings is another useful tool. Now, one last thing I should mention, just a couple additional considerations to improve the efficiency of your focus groups or mini focus group. Consider time. If you have 1 hour and you have 6 respondents, that means at most they each have less than 10 minutes of speaking time. Now that may not be a great use of their time, but be aware of that, be cognizant of that in terms of how many people you bring to the table, how many questions you're going to ask, how many objectives you have, and how deep you need to go into each of those answers. What about no-shows? Plan for no-shows. If you feel you need 6 to 8 key opinion leaders, or if you have a seating chart, but you expect that maybe 2 or 3 people won't show, plan ahead of time so that your seating chart doesn't have 3 empty seats next to one another or one person sitting at a table by themselves. So plan for things like no-shows. And then finally, prepare your tools, your manipulatives. Make sure you have samples for everyone and a few extras. If you want to talk about a clinical pathway or a therapy timeline, have a big example of that available, maybe on the wall that people can put sticky notes on. Have your manipulatives ready. Whatever worksheets you need, like the prior worksheets, it takes time to prepare, but it's well worthwhile to making a more efficient event. A nice exercise that we find is very useful also is put people in a situation of having to invest or spend the money from a budget on different options for therapies, for example, or different types of improvements to their imaging capabilities, and give them monopoly money. Give them play money and say, here's your budget. You've got $1 million budget. How would you allocate it across these different options? It's a fun exercise for everyone, and it's very revealing for you to see when they're working with real money and a limited budget, where would they spend those dollars? So that's focus groups. Now, for some objectives in some situations, focus groups or a focus group setting with a moderator is not ideal. For example, if you know the group will have particularly challenging participants, some of your key opinion leaders are particularly verbose, or they're more senior than the others, and they'll keep the others from speaking. If you have a very large group, say 15 respondents or 25 or even 40 people, a focus group clearly is not the best way to manage that. What if the purpose of the meeting is to arrive at a decision that's potentially contentious? A better tool for that is a facilitated conversation. Now, what is a facilitated conversation? We talked about moderated focus groups, so it requires just a bit of clarity on the difference between moderators and facilitators. Of course, their role is as diverse as the topics themselves and the objectives you're going to have. But despite the common interchange of the words moderator and facilitator, the nuances between the two may be more important than most people think. According to the International Association of Facilitators, and yes, there really is such a thing, a facilitator takes a strategic and comprehensive view of the objectives and the central research question for your group, and then selects the specific problem-solving and decision-making process that matches the group's needs, and chooses the tools that are appropriate, whether it's flip charts or scoring rubrics or samples, to help the group achieve consensus or describe objectively any disagreements. The facilitator helps the group understand the techniques so that the group members can focus on the substantive issues, the objectives to be addressed. A facilitator is trusted by all the group members as a neutral party and should not impart any bias or vested interest in the outcome even by the way they ask the questions. So a facilitator doesn't take a particular position in the discussion, even though they take the responsibility to improve the group process by maybe deciding on exactly what process and tools are going to be used for the conversation. So a facilitator suggests a more open and a less controlling position being taken by the leader of the meeting, as opposed to a moderator, which implies greater control, more direction, and responsibility for the outcomes. So what is a facilitated discussion, and how can you use it for your key opinion leaders? You've all been in meetings and group discussions that tend to wander all over the place, and then they get sidetracked by the loud and verbose. And then when it comes time to draw conclusions and make decisions, no one's ready because the wayward discussion kind of confused and misled and obfuscated the issue and resulted in too little information, nor decisions being made. And this is particularly true for larger groups. There are side conversations, there are distractions, or groups where you have a really strong alpha or 2 or 3 that tend to dominate the conversation. To prevent this, the MarkeTech group often recommends the use of what's called an ORID facilitated discussion technique for focused conversations. It was developed by the Institute for Cultural Affairs as part of their Technology of Participation materials back in the 60s, and it's designed to promote clarity during a group discussion. It's facilitator-led. It's been used by organizations like the UN, and it's outstanding for large groups to manage the large group dynamics and for getting to a decision, for making a decision. It eliminates a lot of the rambling and the lack of focus. It tends to engage everyone in a group, even in groups up to 40 we've done, when key opinion leaders from various competitors and across different regions were brought together. Using this ORID technique, you can manage a group of up to 40 people and potentially more, but that's about the maximum that's manageable, and engage everyone. And it's naturally analytical because once you've gained agreement to use this facilitated structured conversation approach, it follows a process called ORID, which is a natural way that humans think about new information. It's an objective factual step, reflective, interpretive, and decisional, and we'll talk about that process, how you walk people through this. ORID is excellent for analyzing facts and feelings, to understand implications, and to facilitate intelligent group decision making. And it follows this process, which is often unconscious, but it's a sequence that humans think about new information. Now, there are some limitations. It requires a trained facilitator because the phrasing at each step is critical to walk people through this process. And a facilitator needs to be very sensitive when you do this to ensure that people stay on track, that during the objective session, they stay on objective. The participants have to respect the process, and it's important that the facilitator keeps them on track and sometimes needs to bring people back in. And another limitation is that it requires adequate uninterrupted time because people need to be able to walk through this thinking process. Now, that doesn't mean you need a lot of time. These sessions can be done in an hour, and sometimes they'll be an entire day. But the process basically is these 4 distinct steps. And if participants all actively participate and the facilitators do their jobs to facilitate the discussion and help everyone follow the deceptively simple rules, everyone tends to be happily surprised with the results at the end. Every time that we've used this ORID technique with a new group of people, there's some frowns initially because they see this large group. They know how those meetings tend to go. But they buy in, and as you go through it, by the end of the session, both your participants, key opinion leaders, high-level influencers and decision makers, and our clients, the moderators, facilitators, are all very satisfied, and it's amazing how quickly you get to results. One caveat, and I've mentioned this before, with this technique, it's really important to plan and have a detailed plan. One of our clients said, doing a session like this is like planning a wedding. When it goes off beautifully like this, no one knows how much work went into it. you've got to make sure that you get the background of the facility where you're going to be, the participants, the speaker's topics, or how you're going to present the topic at hand. Templates for everyone to share. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this in terms of planning. We're not going to talk about all these. Just make a note when you plan something like a focused conversation using an ORID technique. It's extremely important that it flows smoothly, take into account and plan well what's going to be discussed, who's participating, when do you need to be where, and when are different things happening so you stay on time, how many. Large events, when you have a large number of participants, the most successful inevitably have a dedicated event planner that takes care of all these logistics so that the event flows smoothly and the facilitator and your participants can really focus on the topic at hand. So what is it? The objective questions occur first. This is when you ask people to reflect, to objectively state the facts about the topic. So you present them a topic. Maybe you have some experts in the field present on a new technology. Maybe you discuss with them a new imaging modality, maybe a new surgical approach. First thing to do after that's been presented to them, or if they've just been at a conference where they've been discussing a certain topic, is ask them to discuss the facts about the topic. It may seem too obvious, but it's important because it sets the framework around which the reflective and interpretive steps are built. 5 to 20 minutes typically. Focus on the facts. These need to be documented, but don't start analyzing. First, the facts, not feelings or interpretations. If someone says, well, I think such and such, a red flag should go up, warning bell should go off. If they say, I feel, that's not objective. It should be just the facts, ma'am. I heard this. Evidence shows that. You can ask them what 2 keywords from this morning's presentations about the topic at hand stood out to you and write them down. If time allows, what capability do you remember? What topic or phrase did you see that really stood out? Focus on the facts. You'll then move toward a reflective series of questions. This is the gut feel about the topic, or the gut feel about the new concept you have, the feel about maybe the messaging, the ads that they just reviewed. What feelings were elicited? They don't have to have facts to support them, but how do you feel about it? Again, the gut feelings might have no basis in facts, but they just might not like that ad. They might say, that ad made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to read it. Ask them the positives. What made them excited? What interested you the most about this new technique? What are you most curious about when you see this new imaging method that doesn't require any contrast agent? What was your favorite part of this morning's presentation, the high point? Also ask them the negatives. What makes them wary? What interests you the least? What concerns do you have? So this is all about feelings. Then you can move on to interpreting the meaning and value of the topic, especially with clinicians and healthcare professionals. There's a tendency for people to want to jump from the reflective questions to the decisional and skip this step, but don't. This step can, if you miss it, you can miss important omissions, or you can have important omissions and miss important findings. Trust the process. Remind them it's been used many times to successfully bring a group to cohesive decisions. It's important to do this. What are the impacts and significance of the new information? What does it mean for you? Who will best be served by this? Those are the types of questions you ask at this stage. What are the implications of the new technology? Maybe review the word summary from the objective step. Ask them, what's the significance of these words from the objective step? Clearly, you'll need to document these and very quickly create this, but that's why you may want to have a scribe and work with 2 people. Have someone else on your team taking notes, create this Word document. Now they can interpret, why were these the words that were most meaningful? And finally, you'll go to the decisional step, and this is where it's important to facilitate well, monitor your time so that you can get to this step. Based on the information, what are the future impacts of the topic? Recap what's been said so far. About 10 to 30 minutes for the decisional questions is typical for this decisional step. And then focus your key opinion leaders on the future. Ask them what changes would be made with the introduction of these new product enhancements. How will you use this new information, for example? What changes need to happen to access this new capability? My personal favorites, because they're very useful and actionable for you, are what do you as key opinion leaders need to do to bring these capabilities to patients? Or what is the company's best course of action to get this into the hospitals and make it available? So what type of outcomes can you get from this? During the objective step, you'll get factual observations. You'll see what did your key opinion leaders actually understand from your concept, or what do they understand about the new technology your research team has developed and how it can be applied. The reflective step, what are the emotions that came out of this? Whether you're ad testing or you have a new contrast-free imaging methodology, how do people feel about it? Does it make them nervous? They start asking questions like, what if it makes me nervous because seems like it requires more dose, or I'm not sure I'm going to get a great image. So what emotions are elicited? And this gives you guidance for if there are concerns, what do you need to provide data to comfort people for? If there are things that they're particularly excited about, maybe that's what you want to lead with your advertising message. During the interpretive step, what do the KOLs perceive to be the impact? What are the pros and cons, for example? What's the impact of this new IT system? Well, it might mean we can reduce our lab staff, but they're going to need additional training to use this system, things like that. And then finally, the decisional step may be a little more straightforward, but this is the call to action. What do the players need to do based on all the information that they discussed about the feelings they had? What does the company need to do? What do the key opinion leaders need to do? And this gives you very clear actions that need to be implemented. How do you need to present this technology? What data is required? Maybe what clinical research is required? What's the next step? This prototype was great, but it's not going to work for a left-handed physician, for example. So this is then the decisional step is you need to make sure it works for both-handed physicians. So that's an example of a facilitated conversation. The final technique we're going to talk about is a mock trial. And a mock trial, as you can imagine, is taking your group and either planning ahead of time to segment your group or explicitly divide them into two different roles. For example, you can have supporters and detractors of a specific therapy, say medication, a group that you know favors medication and a group that you know favors a surgical therapy. You can manage this by planning the groups ahead of time. Remember, if you know your key opinion leaders, you can plan to have this group is going to be group A because they tend to be more research focused, and these participants are going to be more clinically focused, for example. Or you could break them up by roles, or maybe even the type of hospital they are. So some demographic element to break them into two separate groups. So the roles are assigned. The value of the mock trial or a value analysis committee simulation is witnessing the participants' rationale, which helps you identify potential barriers and promoters. Observe which arguments are most persuasive, and it's fun. It really is fun to do this. Set them up as two teams. The process is you establish the case. What are they going to argue? Maybe it's which advertising messages are most impactful to getting this new thing adopted by the hospital administration. And each group has to meet separately, and then they're going to come back and argue their case. Why is this? These are our top three advertising messages, and the other group will inevitably come up with another three because you set them up. This group is a bunch of neurologists, and the other group is a bunch of cardiologists. You establish the argument that needs to be made. What's the case to be argued? You have facilitated depositions where each group goes into a separate area. You select the lead attorneys. Each group will pick a representative. Then they come back for a trial. They argue their cases, and then the jury votes. The jury could be you and your colleagues. It could be whoever you assigned, or you could have a judge assigned. The value is really in identifying what arguments are made and used. Oh, and also don't forget the prizes. Have a prize for the winner and for the runner-up. Get it? The limitations of this, though, are it's best with diverse respondents. If you have a very homogeneous group, they're probably less likely to develop strong perceptions and different perceptions, so they create something to argue. You don't want to have the two deposition groups come up with the same top 3 marketing messages, for example. It does have significant logistical preparation requirements, and we'll talk about those. And then it requires multiple moderators and scribes, of course. Again, the importance of planning. In this case, you're going to have to present the topic at hand. Maybe you have a number of presentations about some technology, the impacts of, say, radiation and how radiation can be reduced. So you need to present the background. You have to ensure that you have a location that allows you to have 2 deposition areas where you have the 2 groups break up, then a location where they can come back together and have a ruling, and then you want to ensure time for a recap. So very important that you figure out ahead of time and plan. Again, it's like the wedding. When are things going to happen? What happens when? Who goes where, and where do they go? So you might have to have a layout that here on the right, the room that's the courtroom. Where the presentations are made and where you'll go back to for the hearing and the decision. Then off to the left, you might have breakout room number 1, who's going to go there? Breakout room number 2, who's going to go there? In fact, plan to do this in even more detail. Seating charts, because you want to have people sit in the groups where they'll be representing and building a case. So in this side, group 1 is all on the left. Those are the those are the hospital administrators. All those people have an administrative function. Group 2 on the right, those are your clinicians. Then you ensure that that they know where to go. Group A, the administrators, will go to room A. Group 1 goes to room A, wherever that is. Make sure they know where to go. Group 2 goes to room B, somewhere else. And where are they going to sit so that you can keep track of who's doing what? So you want to know the deposition chambers. Now, the value of a mock trial or a value analysis committee simulation is not just in the result. In fact, the greatest value comes in the development of the arguments. What elements does each team consider when they're brainstorming ideas? What does each team select as salient arguments or messages? How influential is each element that they select? And who is it influential to? Then to what elements does each team finally reduce their argument, and how? They may reduce their argument based on, well, this is great clinically, but it's going to be too costly, so we can't introduce it. And so they may select something else that has a little bit less clinical benefit, but it's more cost effective and more likely to address the needs of more patients, for example. How do they build that case? What are the reasons that some elements are eliminated? The ones that they didn't choose, why did they not choose them? It helps you understand your message. In this case, this deposition group identified 37 characteristics that were important in their vendor. They reduced it to 12 characteristics that were both important and that differentiated between vendors. Then they debated and then narrowed it down to 4 main points to support their argument, though not everyone agreed, and then they presented their case on those 4 main points. It's often useful to tell them when you present your case, you'll have 3 minutes or 5 minutes so that they really distill things down. And this group, by the way, won. You can get things like semi-quantitative data during the depositions. Often it's helpful to have some tools like we talked about for the focus groups. And for the ORID session, maybe you do a mini ORID session during the deposition session. But you can get semi-quantitative data that helps the deposition group, like we just showed you, a scale like this, to help them narrow their choices down in the limited time they have. And so you can get semi-quantitative data as well from the deposition groups. And if you do a number of these, you can combine them and see some differences. So to review, the techniques and methodologies we talked about today were moderated focus groups, facilitated conversations, and mock trials. Why use a structured workshop format when you have a key opinion leader meeting? It's because it's more likely to ensure that your needs are met and your KOL's needs are met if you have a structure with clear objectives and you design your conversation, your meeting, in a way that ensures that everyone's needs will be met, that you will have a sense of accomplishment when you're done, that you will have some actions or decisions at the end of your session. Now, a few final suggestions for a successful workshop. Again, number one on the list is have clear objectives. Number two, logistics. Make sure the facility, your equipment, whatever supplies or prototypes you need. If you need water to dunk your new hemostatic agent in, make sure you have enough water and a tub so that everybody's papers don't get soaked and nobody drops their, puts their cell phone in a bucket of spilled water. Select the proper methodology. Make sure your pre-work is completed. If you can anticipate how the conversation is going to go, have a worksheet ready. Even if it's an Excel worksheet that you can project onto a screen and fill in live with the ideas that people had, and then have it set up so that as they give a score, it helps result in this was the highest choice that you guys had in terms of number, or look, when you put it in, it looks like there's 5 that floated to the top and the rest are far below that in terms of your preference will help them. So have your pre-work done, have materials prepared to ease and make the conversation as productive as possible. Ensure you professionally moderate or facilitate the conversation. Effectively manage the time. And then as you get near the end, always confirm and validate the conclusions, because remember, you want to have actions or decisions and you want to make sure that they're correct. So give your respondents, your participants, a chance to correct you if maybe you misinterpreted something. You may even want to throw in a red herring, something that you know isn't quite what they said, to make sure that they're still paying attention, but also to challenge them to correct a certain nuance. And then, of course, the participants want to have a sense of accomplishment and they want to feel like they influence the development of something helpful. So confirming and validating your conclusions will help them do that. So appropriate preparation is important. It's like planning a wedding, remember? So I hope this was helpful for everyone. On behalf of the MarkeTech group, we'd like to thank everyone for your time. We really appreciate your feedback about this webinar and a quick survey you'll see in a moment. And of course, if you have further questions about any of these techniques, don't hesitate to call. We're happy to help you with that. We're here to answer your questions. It's what the MarkeTech group does. So please contact TMTG to be your strategy and marketing research partner. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for your time. I see that there are a few additional questions. We'll address those afterwards. Good day, everyone.